Hello, my name is Dr. Ron Eaglin, coming to you from Daytona State College, and this is CEN 3722, Human-Computer Interaction. And what we're going to do today is we're going to just give an overview of this class and what you're going to learn in it. So, the objectives here is to truly get an understanding of what is human-computer interaction, or as we like to call it, HCI. The other abbreviation you're going to hear me use all the time is UI, which is user interface, and I will often use those interchangeably. You'll need to understand why the field of HCI is important, and to do that, you also need to understand user-centered design and all the concepts that go with user-centered design. The overall goal of HCI is to create usable systems, and that's where our whole focus will be. Now, to do this, we also need to understand the concepts of all the different types of design methodologies, but important here is the HCI design methodology, where we actually build something, prototype it, and test it with real users, and then repeat that process. So you're going to have to learn how to create prototypes, and you're going to have to learn how to evaluate prototypes, which means that you will need to know how your users are going to use it. Now, all of this design occurs within a context, and a context is the overall everything that goes with that design. So looking at it from 30,000 feet, the context in HCI involves the users, the tasks that need to be performed, and the technology that they're going to actually use to perform those tasks. So there's a whole lot associated with context, because context can also include all the social parameters that are occurring at the time, and that could be or might not be part of the context. But there's many factors associated with the context. Really, the most important factor of the context is the understanding of your users and the organization. But don't forget that you can also have things like cost and platform, which are part of the context itself. So why is the HCI even important? Well, we all know that technology is extremely pervasive. All of us use technology all the time, and we really do want to have systems that are usable and safe and functional and do what we want to do when we want them to do it and do it safely. So let's talk a little bit about what is usability. Well, I think all of us have been confronted with the situation where we've got to use a new system, and sometimes using that new system on a computer can be extremely scary. Break out the user's manual. But a well-designed system doesn't require a user's manual. It's usable from day one. In fact, you should be able to use the system, walk away, come back 6 months or a year later, and still be able to use it. That's that recall function that you have. It has to do what you need it to do. It's got to be productive. And you want to actually have a sense of reliability that when you did it, it actually got the job done, the accuracy. And bottom line is you actually want to walk away having a good experience, to be satisfied with using the system and just an overall good feeling. So let's talk a little bit about user-centered design, because this is one of the key fundamental pieces in HCI. Now remember that everything that we talk about today, we're going to cover in a lot of depth during this course. But in HCI, design is done from the perspective of the user. And it's understanding how to design things from the perspective of the user that is extremely important, because many designers love to design from their own perspective, and that would be the perspective of the designer. Okay, to understand the user perspective, you've got to be able to understand the user. And there's a lot of things about understanding the user that can be very important, such as understanding the difference between a customer and a user, and a customer may not be the user. But in user-centered design, feedback is one of the crucial things, and you work with the users, and iteration is an important part. So the golden rule of user-centered design: know thy user. And knowing thy user means knowing a lot about thy user. Being able to model and predict the user is one of the major goals of HCI. So what do we mean by that? Well, users may have physical limitations, they may have cognitive limitations, but we also have all sorts of different cognitive abilities. And if you don't understand cognition, don't worry, we're going to talk about cognition quite a bit, that ability for the mind to learn. Culture has a big role in this, and so does the basis of user experience, knowing thy user. So, for example, back in the old computer days, back in the DOS days, we used to type in directory structures. And I think most users that are watching this will actually know what a directory is on a computer. But remember the days when you used to have to remember what that directory was. So if you were to look at this and say, memorize this directory structure so that you can get to this directory, you might have a hard time doing that. Well, in user-centered design, you understand that it's much easier to recall or much easier to recognize than it is to recall. So having a directory structure where you're actually prompted for the next directory in a tree is a much more usable design than something that you have to memorize everything. Now, you would think with all of that we know about HCI and you taking this class and being a great designer, we would never have systems that are unusable. Well, let's talk about the team. The team is the group of people that implement the designs. And the team can consist of the HCI person, which can be a psychologist, a human factors engineer, or a design engineer, but you've also got software developers that are associated too, and graphics designers, and marketing. Now you've got lots of input. And when all that input comes together, the overall arching goal of usability is often lost. You need to keep that in the focus because the biggest focus should always be in any design, if you're doing it correctly, the user, because that's who's going to use the system. So the most crucial person on any software design team is actually the user. Now, let's go back to that concept of design. This is a traditional design cycle, okay? You figure out what you need to do, and eventually you're going to do some design, and you're going to go ahead and prototype it and return back around. This is actually part of a user-centered design type of design, but true user-centered design makes the whole thing go full circle. Everything is part of the design process and everything is iterative. So you design, you prototype, you get results, you put it out in the real world, you get feedback, and you come back along. We know all this because we always know about version 1 and version 2 and version 3, and hopefully, as you go through those versions, the design gets more usable and better. There are some exceptions, and we have seen those exceptions, and we typically call them bombs. You need to understand the concept of prototyping, how to build prototypes. And I've built hundreds of prototypes. My first prototypes might be something built on a whiteboard or just using cards, and I'll actually have users go through a whiteboard-based design, just what they would do on a whiteboard before I've ever built anything. Why do I do that? Well, that's a very inexpensive way to knock out some really bad stuff right off the bat. Now, the evaluation of the design, and that is where it really comes down, where the rubber meets the road, is when you evaluate that design, because that's where you're going to make the decisions that lead into that next design cycle. And understanding the user, but being able to model the user. Whenever you actually bring users into the process, you add a level of expense. So being able to take care of some of the things that you can fix in a design before you involve the users is a good thing to do. These are called discount usability techniques. We know a lot about designing and how to evaluate designs. So if we can produce a design and we can go through an evaluation cycle where we knock out those things that don't make sense, when you look at it and say, well, why is the user having to do that step? And we get rid of a step that they don't need, we can make a better design before we've actually ever had to go into that end user testing. But in user-centered design, at some point, you're always going to go to the user testing. The user does need to be involved. But realize that when you bring in the users, you add an element of expense. And even if the users are free or volunteers, collecting the feedback and implementing it into the design cycle is not. So there is always going to be an associated expense when you go to the user-centered design. Now, I know I moved through all of this fast, but everything that we've covered here is going to be covered in depth in this class. The summary, though, is that you should understand what actually, from a big overview, what is HCI and why is HCI important? You should understand what is user-centered design? What does it mean when I say user-centered design? And what are some of the aspects of the concept of usability? So as we move on through this class, we're going to delve into a lot of detail with each of these topics. But for now, hopefully you've got a good understanding of what the big picture of HCI is and are ready to move forward with all that we're going to learn this semester. I hope you have a great time. Thank you very much.